Always a pleasure to talk to a fellow food nerd, but I'm also very excited to talk to you about something that I think doesn't really show up in my consciousness enough, which is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or NAFLD. And everything that you share about it has really just gotten me thinking. It's like, I really think that we should actually talk about this on the pod because it's a far more common issue than many people might expect. So maybe we should just start with the basics, lay the foundation,
Mhm.
like what is NAFLD? And also, we're calling it something different these days.
Yes, yeah. So there's definitely a few things there. I'm really happy to be here. Really happy to chat, and likewise on the nerding out stuff. I'm sure we'll be doing that today. So I mean, a few things for sure. I mean, first of all, what draws me into interest in fatty liver nutrition is because I have pretty broad interests in the world of nutrition science. And it just so happens that liver health, and in the context of fatty liver disease, and I actually in my head I say NAFLD, or the new terminology which is MASLD, and I'll allude to that shortly. But the liver really brings it all together, and it's kind of like a proxy for me to teach people the things I want to teach them, but give them a more compelling reason why they should care. I think, and hopefully I think you understand what I mean when I say that. And yeah, so as a fellow dietitian, you could probably see that more than maybe, let's say, the average person, but that is kind of the not so secret of why I'm so passionate about it. So, NAFLD, fatty liver, and MASLD is essentially replacing the word fatty with steatotic for the most part. I mean, and the goal is to be a less stigmatizing term. I just don't know how many people really are caught up with that terminology, so I don't use it yet. And so that's kind of my justification there. But the term was changed for that reason, generally just to make it more friendly. And definition of the condition is pretty much what it sounds like. Fat ends up in your liver where it shouldn't be, to be put quite simply. Now, the reasons why that happens, well, I'm sure we'll discuss, but things have to kind of go a little bit sideways metabolically, perhaps for, someone's nutrition hasn't quite been where it could be, physical activity maybe not where it could be, and then over time, fat builds up in the liver, and that leads to kind of a cascade of issues. And that is, kind of a nutshell intro.
Yeah. What you said about using fatty liver disease as sort of a proxy for our advice, because let me tell you, nothing makes fiber sexier than talking about the microbiome, and 100% like that's my world.
Yeah.
Although, as a GI dietitian, and I just don't ever think about the liver as well. So I'm so glad we're having this conversation. And maybe let's go there now too. Why
Sure.
is this happening? Because I think, we hear fats in the liver. We might instantly think, oh, fats in my food. How do the fats end up in the liver? What's going on in the body metabolically that all
Mhm.
this fat goes where it's not supposed to?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, there's a few fun topics there, and it's interesting because I was actually thinking about making a video. Why does eating certain types of fat make result in less fat in the liver? So I mean, this will partially answer that. So there's two answers I could give you. I could give you kind of a very simple generic answer, which is what I alluded to a second ago, which is maybe the nutrition, the physical activity haven't quite been there, and then as a result, your body doesn't work in its most optimal way, and it does things that are less than optimal, including putting fat in the liver. The more fancy way to put it is the following, is that generally there are four things that happen that can lead to and worsen fatty liver disease. And I'll give a little bit of nuance where appropriate, but those four things generally are insulin resistance, and that's a really big one. High triglycerides, inflammation, and then imbalances in the gut microbiome, because the liver and the gut are connected through the portal system, so their fate is intertwined a little bit, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. Now, so to your other question, which is maybe a little bit more complicated, but not that much more complicated, which is dietary fat and its influence on liver fat. Well, so insulin resistance, right? This is a big word these days, and it's associated with a lot of different conditions. Now, many people think about insulin and they think about carbohydrate metabolism, which is just a fancy way to say reducing blood sugar and what happens with blood sugar, right? But insulin also plays a big role in fat metabolism, which means that if you have insulin resistance, generally what happens is the amount of fats floating in your blood, and we all have sugar and fat floating in our blood within a normal range, but generally, if insulin resistance goes up, the fat in your blood goes up. Oversimplification, but still true. And if there's too much fat in your blood and your body's not responding to certain hormones as it should, then that's where errors can start to occur. And then one of those errors is fat being stored in your liver where it's just simply not supposed to be. And then as an aside to that, so certain types of fat, like monounsaturated fat found in nuts and avocado, they actually lower insulin resistance and they lower inflammation. So as a result, they put your body in a position to store less liver fat, even though they contain fat. And that would be a quick answer to that.
Getting like pounding on your side, like are you accidentally like hitting your desk or anything?
Interesting. I don't think so.
Okay.
But let me try extra hard to just back up and not touch anything.
Yeah, maybe only because I'm getting like a pretty like. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Let me know if it still happens. Maybe
yeah, for sure. I mean, like at the end of the day, sometimes you're just gonna have sounds and it's like whatever, but like it's just consistent. Okay. All right. So I want to break this down a little bit more because I think, particularly when we're exposed to information online, there are so many logical arguments made for our nutrition, like blood sugar spikes. Oh no, diabetes. Oh no, never eat oats again, right? Like these things make sense in people's minds, but often nutrition and metabolism don't actually make logical sense to people. So if we're breaking down what you just said, certain types of fats can influence our insulin resistance. And insulin is about carbohydrate metabolism, but fats can influence the way that our body is processing and handling carbohydrates. But then our carbohydrate metabolism or insulin resistance is affecting the body's ability to like where and how it processes these fats and where it's putting them. Is that correct in a nutshell?
Yeah, it's a bidirectional. I guess it's a bidirectional relationship. So they absolutely influence each other.
Yeah. And so in terms of the path to insulin, let's start there. The path to insulin resistance in terms of just basic sort of like risk factors and, preventable, actionable things we can do. If insulin resistance is one of these sort of like, leading towards or increasing your risk for fatty liver, like let's talk about like how do we sort of think about preventing or avoiding risk factors for insulin resistance?
For sure. Okay, so I guess let's think about three topics. I would say, physical activity plays a role. I've seen quite a few studies that if you are going from no physical activity to 150 minutes a week, that in itself will lower liver fat content by 30%, which is very meaningful. So that could be as straightforward, and I appreciate it's not always like straightforward in quotes. 5 brisk 30-minute walks a week, that would be sufficient if you were not being active at all to reduce liver fat. That's not directly related to your question, but insulin resistance and liver fat go together. So what I'm saying is
super important.
Yeah. So that's one. The second thing is going to be to get adequate protein. Now, protein obviously is a hot topic. So, and I know that lofty protein targets get thrown around online, sometimes appropriately, sometimes not. What I saw recently in a paper, and so again, big numbers, like you see people saying like a gram of protein per pound of body weight or 2 grams per kilo. What I would say is I would not go below half a gram per pound or 1.1 grams per kilo. So that this message is for someone out there who sees these big targets online, is really struggling to hit them, and maybe just wants something more practical for themselves. So what I've seen is that when you get below that, the risk of insulin resistance and fatty liver goes up quite a bit. Again, just based on evidence that I've seen, being in this world. So I would say, 0.5 grams per pound of body weight. That's another one. The third factor is, there's a few ways to look at it. We could call it, the glycemic index quality of the diet, the total, what I would consider quality, robustness, and diversity in the diet. Because if we think about diet and insulin resistance, well, what foods do we have pretty good evidence that reduce insulin resistance? Well, the two that jump out to me that are generally underconsumed for various reasons are legumes and nuts. And of course, nuts. Parallels would be seeds, avocado, and olives for those who may be allergic. These two food groups are generally underconsumed relative to their benefit. And if I was to give advice to a random person on the street, I would say to eat these two things more often, and they will likely give you the biggest return on investment for reducing insulin resistance as part of a dietary strategy.
Yeah, I love that. And we just previously did an episode on the Mediterranean diet with Vanessa
Mm-hmm.
Perrone, and that was also another key. And I think for anyone listening to this, these are the take-home messages that again and again it comes back to simple. But again, simple is not always easy. But this
Mm-hmm.
commitment to basics, like legumes, are fantastic. They're so high in fiber. They got a little bit of plant-based protein in there. They're rich in vitamins, minerals. They're also really affordable foods. And particularly
Mm-hmm.
when we're getting so many mixed messages online and a lot of sales messages online, buy this like $150 supplement. Actually, if you spent $150 on legumes, you would feed yourself for months. And those are things that we have real tangible research to say eat these legumes consistently, and we see these positive outcomes in the literature.
Absolutely. Personally, I consider, and I have a piece of writing which is actually titled this. I consider legumes the most underappreciated food family, and as little as, and I quite literally just shared it at the time of us recording this, a quarter cup of lentils a day is enough to measurably reduce insulin resistance. Half a cup will reduce it more, and we're talking on a daily basis. Half a cup will reduce it more, but and again, I'm referencing one specific study, but it's not double the effect, which basically means that to have them at all, the benefit scales, but to have them at all is massively important. You can worry about the exact quantity, you know, as your personal preference dictates.
Yeah. And this is probably the perfect segue then to talk about two other factors that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
which are the gut microbiome and inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
So, if legumes can be beneficial for insulin resistance, you start to think, oh, well, how can that be possible? And perhaps there's a little connection there with the microbiome.
Yeah, no, there absolutely is. I mean, well, legumes have a incredibly unique profile where they're the only food generally that has a meaningful amount of fiber and a meaningful amount of protein in the same place. And obviously, those are two really important influential factors when you talk about insulin resistance and fatty liver. Now, legumes also influence the gut microbiome, right? And studies on this, they improve the microbiome diversity levels of healthy bacteria, which then improves short chain fatty acid production, which is just what kind of like just for the sake of simplification that these healthier bacteria make these compounds. Those compounds positively influence insulin metabolism, and they reduce the effect of foods on blood sugar levels and so on. And then you also have the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the gut and the liver are connected through the portal system. And probiotics are actually, in terms of quantity and quality of studies, probiotics are the most well studied supplement in terms of providing some level of benefit for fatty liver. Now, a probiotic alone is not going to revolutionize your liver health if you have fatty liver. But if someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, Andy, well, I'm not going to change anything in my life besides taking 5 supplements," probiotics would make the top five in terms of evidence based practice. Now, the how I explain this is basically the following: when your gut microbiome is in a good place, it creates beneficial compounds, and if the microbiome and the liver are connected, those beneficial anti-inflammatory compounds get sent to the liver where they have anti-inflammatory influence. But the reverse is also true. If your microbiome is in a less good place, like dysbiosis, being the scientific term I guess we could use, it can create inflammatory compounds. Those get sent to the liver. Those worsen fatty liver because inflammation, first of all, causes more insulin resistance and also worsens liver health by directly damaging the liver over time. So that would be my kind of somewhat scientific but also somewhat straightforward explanation about the connection.
Yeah, well, you're definitely in a safe nerd space here. So
Sure.
like you can totally like go for it. But I think it
Perfect.
really hammers home this idea that it's all connected. And a lot of us as health professionals, and I think you and I are excluded from this, but a lot of us, because of how we learn about the body in systems and in silos, we sort of get into this cardiovascular place or this like GI place. And in reality, everything that happens in the body is connected, because I think some people would be really surprised to hear, oh, wow, the gut is connected to inflammation, and that inflammation is going to be connected to insulin resistance. Like, these are two seemingly
Yeah.
unrelated things. And this is why it comes back to again and again, well, I'm looking for some sort of like superfood to fix my liver. Have you tried legumes? Like, here's all the ways
Right.
that this very simple food impacts your health in like a significant way.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I mean, a great example of the connection between the microbiome and inflammation and fatty liver. I mean, there are multiple studies that demonstrate that you give a probiotic, specific type of multi-strain probiotic to someone with a fatty liver over an extended period, that their inflammatory markers go down. Again, it's not to say that the research is like insurmountable yet. It's obviously relatively emerging, but that's still meaningful, and it also reflects the importance of, are there certain dietary components that can influence the microbiome, what's their relevance for liver health, and so on.
Yeah. So if someone is listening to this and thinking, I wonder if this is an issue for me, maybe they have type 2 diabetes or they're in a pre diabetic state, they are feeling some changes, they're thinking maybe my nutrition isn't right. Like, are there some warning signs or symptoms or some labs that they might want to ask their doctor for to start investigating this?
Yeah, the labs is where you can get a lot of value because, fatty liver, for example, I mean, the symptoms are at fatigue at most. And, fatigue is such a general thing, right? It can happen for a lot of reasons. So I don't necessarily think that's a reliable indicator. Some people may get pain in the area, but again, that's not necessarily common. So it really does come down to blood work. And when you look at blood work, there's a lot that you could be interested in. So, for example, so some things to consider: triglycerides high, not good; ApoB high, not good; HDL, which is like the good cholesterol, low, not good. The liver enzymes, obvious on some level. GG, so there's numerous liver enzymes: AST, ALP, and then GGT. And GGT, scientists seem to think, is the most useful indicator. So it's the one that you least want to be elevated, essentially. So I would look at those. And then if you have more robust blood work where you can make calculations on insulin resistance, or your practitioner can make calculations in that regard, that's also useful. And then beyond that, I mean, things like A1C, I'm sure is definitely going to be talked about in every context anyway. So,
Yeah. So with A1C clearly being like a blood sugar marker, let's talk
mhm.
about triglycerides, because I think that, again, this is perhaps not sort of like instantly understood blood marker. People are like,
Mhm.
oh, there's fats in my blood. That has to do with the fats that I eat. How
Mhm.
do we get high triglycerides? How does that actually happen?
Yeah, so I mean, an easy way to think about triglycerides for people who are listening, I guess, is kind of like how you have blood glucose and then you have triglycerides, and I think that's maybe a decent way to think about it. Some of the things have been associated with like higher triglyceride levels: alcohol consumption, kind of a higher glycemic index diet. Those are two big ones, or just maybe generally not enough consumption of the components that maintain triglyceride levels, and omega threes are a big one, particularly EPA and DHA. And now that gets very interesting because EPA and DHA are only found in fatty fish, or of course they can be accessed for vegans, via algae-based supplements. But that's it could be very easy for someone who otherwise puts their best foot forward to have no exposure to EPA or DHA, which are just the type of omega three, again, only found in like salmon, sardines, trout, herring, mackerel, or in supplemental form. So I would look at that. Now, nut intake also lowers triglycerides. Nuts, again, are, for many people, their intake is managed or avoided, maybe because they're trying too hard to divert their caloric intake, or for whatever other reason. So I would look to some of those areas.
Yeah. And that's a really important point to sort of reinforce too, is that because so much of nutrition over the decades, but particularly still for many people, nutrition is often thought about in terms of weight loss and in terms of
Mm-hmm.
calories. And that can be, if that's your goal, that's one thing. but we often forget that nutrition exists because your body metabolically has needs. And so nuts
Hmm.
is a really perfect example of that, that so many people will eschew nuts because they say, oh, they're very high calorie or they're very high fat. But nuts, in terms of overall nutrition and supporting the body's metabolic needs and also health outcomes, they're really important food to consume. And so what would you recommend in terms of like daily consumption of nuts? Like, what do you think is like a good ballpark serving to shoot for?
Yeah, so I'll give you that, and I'll extend that a little bit because actually there's some connection even with weight loss that people might not expect. And by the way, just for anyone listening again, you may be told if you get a fatty liver, the main course of action to kind of like reverse it is to lose weight. But there are many studies that show dietary changes and physical activity changes will reduce liver fat content independent of changes in weight loss. So just, everyone can pursue what they want to pursue, but just know that because I do work with people and we all do that. They put their best foot forward. They truly do the best they can with what they've got, and they do great. And maybe their weight doesn't budge. So that demographic of people needs to know that they're doing meaningful work. So that being said, I think for nut intake, it really depends how much you like them and how much you're willing to allot to them. I've seen studies up to 60 grams a day and as little as 30 grams a day. So let's call that, a third cup to maybe half a cup range. Again, as little as a quarter cup, or the equivalent of maybe like a small avocado for those who are allergic to nuts. I think that in my vision of high level nutrition for those who like these foods, one or the other would be included most days. I mean, nutrition is a game of averages. You don't have to include it every single day, of course, but at some point it has to be included enough so that it represents your average intake. So that's how I would look at it. And I saw some evidence around insulin sensitivity in the brain cells and how that affects people's ability to lose body fat over time. And so this is funny. So nut intake actually can reduce brain cell insulin sensitivity, based on some limited but compelling evidence. And it's very counterintuitive, right? So nuts, high in calories, high in fat, but they can actually, if you look at things in the medium term, they can increase some of your success for losing body fat and keeping it off by improving brain cell insulin sensitivity. So just another point in the nuts corner there.
Yeah, and I think it really reinforces this point of what makes logical or intuitive sense to you might not actually be how the body works, because you take this like
Mm-hmm.
high calorie, high fat food, but it affects you metabolically in a way that actually might be supportive of like your healthiest weight long term.
100%.
Yeah.
Nuts are extraordinarily unique.
Yeah,
You
they're
know.
incredible. I mean, plant girl right here. There are nuts on my plate every single
Yes.
day. So maybe let's then shift. So if someone is hearing this, maybe they have a diagnosis already, or maybe they're hoping to prevent because they have like some risk factors, for example, like
Mm-hmm.
insulin resistance. And we were going to, give them some general nutrition recommendations. Like, what would you say would be the overall dietary pattern, or how would you arrange someone's plate? Like, what are the foods you want someone to eat more of? We have legumes already, we have nuts already, but in general, what should the diet aim to look like over time?
Yeah, so I think for sure legumes and nuts. I mean, in like a quote unquote perfect world, I would say daily. If you got diagnosed with a fatty liver, I think the importance of these foods goes up with the urgency associated with them. Right? I guess that's a way to put it. Um, so I would say those two for sure, and then you get into more, and then of course, and then you want to hit a meaningful protein target, which I put out there as let's say a minimum of zero point 0.5 grams per pound of body weight. It could be higher if you're involved in resistance training or you're quite active, but let's put that as a minimum for now. Let's just say someone's just doing walking and that's what they're doing, right? And then so what do we do with that, and how do we achieve that number? Well, then it gets interesting. The best advice there for me is two things. Generally, to pursue as much variety as possible in your protein intake, which means, if you're like an omnivore and you have options: red meat, eggs, poultry, plant-based protein like tofu, and edamame, and then you have fish, again, salmon, sardines, trout, herring, mackerel, especially the ones high in omega-3. The first thing I would say is pursue as much diversity as possible. But the second thing I would say is to reflect on your life up to this point and where you've skewed in your protein. Now, statistically speaking, you'll have skewed if you're an omnivore, which I guess generally, the biggest percentage of the population is, you'll have had more chicken and beef, which means that in a sense, you have something to perhaps rectify, which is to increase your intake of fatty fish if you like it. Um, And I'll just pause on that for a moment because that's actually quite important. So people who have a fatty liver tend to have lower levels of omega-3, like EPA and DHA, in their liver cell membranes. Now, obviously, the human body is very complicated. So among the many things that influence where fat gets stored is the amount of omega-3 in your cell membranes. So people with a fatty liver have less omega-3 in their cell membranes, reflective of less consumption. Less omega-3 in the cell membranes means the messaging going on is in your at a cellular level is going to be less optimal. Again, that contributes to the increased likelihood that fat gets stored in the liver. So it's another counterintuitive example, I guess, to the theme that you've been building up, which is these fats, more fats in the liver cell of the right type actually reduce liver fat content. So, I mean, fatty fish intake is really important. If anyone listening does not, wants to leverage this information and they don't like fish, an omega-3, an EPA DHA supplement for me, it's basically a must. It's going to be very hard to optimize things and to leverage nutrition science without that if you don't eat fish. So I would say, have the chicken beef you want to have, the eggs you want to have, but really if you like the tofus and the fish of the world, really, trend in that direction. So you hit your protein target, you pursue diversity, pursue a lifetime balance. You look at nuts and legumes as foods to be consumed daily rather than foods to be consumed occasionally. And then we get into more fun scientific stuff. Then we get into things like polyphenols and flavonoids. And these are just basically, these are mainly just found in fruits and vegetables, but it's a whole other world. So we can get a specific into that as you like. You tell me.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear more about that. But I would also like, before we move off from the proteins, I love having omnivores on the podcast because, of course, it gets us into these different perspectives that I won't necessarily share. So because the types of fats, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, the types of fats we consume are important to ensure insulin sensitivity. What is your specific advice around the more saturated fat forward things like red meat? And eggs and cheese, for example?
Yeah, so the approach I usually take is I rarely will comment on them directly, whereas I want you to keep it to a certain number or restrict it, simply because, I mean, there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it ends up being like, if someone asks me privately, it's a different story, right? Because I know exactly what they're doing. I can curate. On social media, there's diminishing returns on how productive that is for obvious reasons. So it's not even worth my time and energy. Second of all, my concern is less with, the inevitable reality is there's certain foods that need to play a bigger role. And it's pretty much inevitable that other foods will have to be displaced to a certain extent to accommodate them. So that's really where I put my energy. Whether someone is going to have 8 ounces of red meat or 12 in the context of a very strong diet, abundant in these other compounds, I don't think it matters that much. It's when it's overpowering and displacing of these other things that I think it becomes problematic. Which is why, like, my approach to nutrition for fatty liver, I refer to it as kind of a curated Mediterranean diet, which is to say, I take the principles from the Mediterranean diet, but for me, Greek yogurt or plant-based yogurt high in protein, or that plays an important role for various reasons. And I'm not concerned with micromanaging poultry intake as like the traditional Mediterranean diet might be, just because there might be diminishing returns on practicality there. So that's how I look at it, and that's how I broach that topic generally. But if someone sat in front of me, they want a number, depending on where they're at, I could give them one.
Yeah. No, thank you for that perspective. And I think it's also important too to sort of, reinforce for folks listening. I think there is often a lack of awareness that how we as dietitians are going to speak to someone one-on-one when we have your entire medical history, your nutritional history. We know what you're eating currently and can see patterns and where there might be benefit from change versus blanket recommendations we throw out into the universe going like, you could have any number of symptoms or conditions or none. You could be a vegan or an omnivore or somewhere in between. Like, how we speak publicly is different than how we speak privately one-on-one.
100%. Although my philosophy, my principles remain the same. Of course, just the level of articulation and specification you can provide is just different. And yeah, I mean, look, the reality is that, sometimes you have to be clever and strategic to deliver a message. You have to be very, you have to understand the climate and the context and to ensure that, your message is not detracted from, so I think that's important.
Yeah, totally. So let's get into the plants. Let's talk about polyphenols and stuff for a sec.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So, polyphenols is a massive group of compounds. Certain foods have more than others. I mean, the subgroup of polyphenols called flavonoids, those are really interesting because even among flavonoids, there's 6 families. So I guess to put it, all flavonoids are polyphenols. Not all polyphenols are flavonoids. Okay, so then we have flavonoids, and so flavonoids are associated with good liver health generally. And so I'll just say the 6 types and some foods that contain them basically. And my advice would be to pursue these foods assertively. Let's put that out there. The one that's really interesting and people generally aren't aware of is flavones. So flavones have been associated directly with reduced amounts of liver fat and directly with reduced insulin resistance markers. Now, the thing with flavones, they're found in very few foods. They're basically found in artichoke, parsley, oregano, and then green pepper and celery. So props to green pepper and celery in the spirit of economics and upping foods that seem kind of not special. In fact, they actually are quite special. And so maybe I owe the medical medium one for that on the celery juice trend all those years ago. I wasn't aware of it at that time, but I'm sure he wasn't either, but that's okay. Anyway, not to speak ill of anyone, but I would say flavones for sure. I think artichoke actually is the most unique vegetable. One of the reasons is flavone content. One of the reasons is prebiotic fiber content, which influences the gut bacteria. Another reason it's high magnesium content, which influences insulin resistance. And the other reason it's actually high in total polyphenols. So in addition to being high in this unique flavonoid, it's high in total polyphenols. So I think artichoke may actually be the most nutritious vegetable for liver health and perhaps the most unique vegetable that exists.
Okay.
So that's that.
Beautiful. I mean, mic drop for artichoke. When do you hear someone waxing lyrical about artichoke? I love it. Also on the parsley, though, I'm bullish on parsley. I just think it's one of the most incredible foods. And similarly, where a bunch of kale might be $5 in the store, usually that bunch of parsley is like $1.99. Yeah. Okay. So flavones. So we got one.
Dried parsley has more. Dried parsley, for what it's worth, and actually I guess it is worth something because I did bring it up. Dried parsley has a much higher concentration. So if you want a herb or spice, you want parsley and oregano, and you want to use it regularly. Herbs and spices can lower inflammatory markers. I mean, there's studies on this. So if that's a blind spot for someone, don't underestimate that. Sorry, and apologies to cut you off there.
No, beautiful. I love it. I mean, plant magic this year is so much about herbs and spices, and I do think because they're not something we think about when we are quote unquote calorie focused or macro focused, they have all of these very valuable compounds that are not necessarily direct nutrients, but have a remarkable impact on our health. So I'm part of the fan club already. All right, let's get into the other types.
Okay, yes. Okay, we talk about flavones. The next really big one has to be anthocyanins. Path of least resistance to get more anthocyanins is going to be blueberries. Anthocyanins are found in pretty much all berries. Pretty much anything that's purplish. Purple corn is very high in it. If anyone can find that, I don't seem to be able to. Eggplant, purple red onions, purple lettuce, anything reddish or purple pomegranate has anthocyanins. The path of least resistance to get them is blueberries. They have a large amount. They're commonly available fresh or frozen. So I would say that. A lot of good evidence, anthocyanins and insulin resistance. So that's another one. So we have anthocyanins, we have flavones, we have isoflavones. So it's shout out to the plants, right? That's tofu, tempeh, edamame, right? Again, these are unique foods, the only foods that contain isoflavones. Studies have demonstrated that people who consume like 4 servings of soy foods a week have about 25% lower risk of fatty liver. Soy at a genetic level changes the expression of certain proteins that play a role in fat metabolism. And fat metabolism is just a fancy way to say fat goes where it should go, not in your liver. Okay, so just to oversimplify it. So again, which is actually why I brought up tofu as part of. I would have for various reasons, but that's one of the reasons why I bring it up as part of the protein rotation. No omnivore has to eat tofu if they don't want, but you also don't have to drink green tea or eat berries if you don't want. And you can still do great, but it's not to say you won't get a benefit from doing so. So anyway, anthocyanins, flavonones, another one. So those are only found in citrus. Okay, so no citrus, no flavonones, right? So oranges, grapefruit. Grapefruit's also very unique. Grapefruit also has beta carotene in it, or the plant form of vitamin A, which actually helps also to reduce fatty liver risk. So that's kind of fun. Lemons, limes, and so on. Then we have flavonols, one with an O and one with an A. So I pronounce it the same way. One of them is found in green tea and dark chocolate. And the other one is found in capers, in leafy greens, asparagus, and onions. So, the reality is there's something unique about almost every fruit and vegetable. It's just a matter of framing it in a way that's cool and fun and compels you to act. But I would look at, flavonoids and polyphenols are words you want to know and want to look up. And you want to, like, if you want to simplify your path forward, pick foods that are high in these compounds. And then you can go from there. You know what I mean? It's not they only have to have these, but I would start there just because the evidence kind of is there, and it also just makes it easier for you to make a decision.
Well, and I think it's so helpful because someone listening to this podcast go like, here's all of this incredible valuable information. Where do I start? The more path is always the easiest path. So if you say, okay, I heard that I need to diversify my protein. I don't need any fish. So this week I can buy more fish. I also heard citrus is really important, and berries are, if you can say this week, I'm going to focus on eating more of these 3 foods, it's a very simple message that we can latch onto that helps us to build self-efficacy and, understand that, we can make these changes. Like we can actually do this and have an impact on our health, which is incredible.
100%. And in terms of easy changes in quotes, again, capers would be a big one. Some decent evidence that capers actually can meaningfully influence like liver enzymes, maybe boost HDL a little bit. But the thing with capers is just you can just throw them on some stuff. You know what I mean? You don't have to do much with them. If you like them, they're very high in polyphenols. They're very high in flavonols, which are quercetin, and which comes up now and then, which is very important. So yeah, I would say capers as just something to have around. I would look at it as a similar vein to parsley. Not too much effort to throw it on stuff, and you will get returns on that if you stick with it.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm a salt focused girl, so like I don't need any other excuse to eat them, but I am happy to do so more often. Okay, in terms of supplements, because I know we always are going to have this question, you have mentioned EPA and DHA. So if someone can't due to allergy or won't because they're vegan like me, getting some EPA and DHA supplementally, do you have some specific guidelines of like minimums, like a minimum DHA target, for example? Does that exist for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the evidence is not there to make like a very high level claim. I think the easiest way to put it is it's going to be between 1 to 3 grams per day. Now, exactly what I might tell someone, it's going to depend, like I said, kind of what we talked about earlier, on precise specifications about where they're at, how much help they need, and what their nutrition looks like. You know what I mean? You take someone who's doing quite well, maybe they get a lot of the the ALA, the plant-based omega-3, their markers are otherwise good. They're going to need 3 grams a day in supplemental form, perhaps not, right? And so someone who eats a bit of fish, but not too much, maybe again, they might be okay with 1 gram. But in terms of the research I've seen, it's 1 to 3 grams per day. And even for triglyceride lowering, I mean, there are pharmaceutical grade like omega-3 supplements that have to be prescribed that have up to 4 grams per day. And those like meaningfully lower triglycerides, but that's a bit of a different story because that's more on the medical side. So yeah, I would say a minimum though for me, like a minimum of a combined gram of EPA and DHA is what you want if you're going to take a supplement.
Great. And I think at the very end, you just hit on a very specific piece of information I want to reinforce that many, particularly if you are taking EPA capsules, they're all 1 gram, but you said 1 gram of the EPA and DHA. So not just a 1 gram capsule with varying amounts of EPA and DHA in it, but 1 gram of the actual EPA and DHA.
Yeah, you definitely want to look at, I think where some people might trip up, and it's confusing even for me, is they'll put a gram amount of the total component, but then you have to look at the milligrams of EPA and DHA and make sure those add up to 1,000 together. Sometimes it's a gram of fish oil, but it's 200 milligrams of each, so that's not quite right. So yeah, definitely look at the individual quantity of EPA and DHA, add those numbers together, and make sure it's 1,000 or more if it's in milligrams, because 1,000 milligrams is 1 gram, and that is probably safe, reasonable advice.
Yeah, that's key. Any other supplements that you would say, of course, individual versus public, but some that people should have on their radar that tend to be more broadly applicable to folks when they're thinking about liver function?
Yeah, so I think the 2 that are most well studied by far are omega-3 and probiotics, right? And then you get into a whole other world. For example, you have milk thistle, and milk, it's a popular one. Milk thistle is actually the compound in milk thistle is actually called a lignin, and lignins are found in flaxseed. So funny enough, so this is where it gets interesting, right? And then there's another, and so I'm going to say a few things, and then I'll backtrack to kind of explain myself in terms of how I look at it. So milk thistle, some evidence it can reduce liver enzyme levels. It's a potent antioxidant, potently anti-inflammatory. It's not going to revolutionize your fatty liver alone. It contains compounds also found in flax seeds, which are a functional like food ingredient. And then there's a new study that looked at something called like camu camu powder, which is just like an isolated Amazonian fruit that's very high in polyphenols. Now that actually helped with fatty liver markers too, but polyphenols are found abundantly in fruit. So then I don't know. Let's say you take a person and they are trying to think, should I take these supplements or not? Well, I guess one way to look at it is if your diet is rich in polyphenols and maybe rich in lignans because you eat flax seeds, you're probably going to get diminishing returns on the value of those supplements because you're already being exposed to those compounds elsewhere. Same thing with EPA and DHA. Like you're not going to, if you eat, so personally, I eat a lot of fish because I'm like mostly pescatarian, not completely. So like I'm not going to get as much return on my investment on omega-3 supplements. I'm already being exposed to huge amounts of omega-3. So the same goes for other compounds too. So that's how I might present those two cases to someone. If someone has no exposure to a certain compound, then okay, the supplement might be more likely to help. There's a third way to look at it, which is, are there parallel concerns? So for example, CoQ10 and curcumin have been studied for some benefit for fatty liver, right? Now, does someone have overlapping concerns? Because you see CoQ10 is associated with like migraine reduction. Curcumin might help with arthritis modestly, let's say. So if they have an overlapping concern, okay, maybe it's easier to justify telling them to take a supplement just simply because, it kind of touches on more than one aspect of areas that they're worried about. I mean, that's how I look at it, how I might explain it to someone. But I mean, the reality is you're not supplementing your way out of a fatty liver. It's going to come from the physical activity and from optimizing your diet, and the supplements will be a complementary and useful piece, and the role they play will depend on how much you're able to do in the other areas. Again, like if you give me a theoretical person that says, Andy, I'm making no changes, tell me 5 supplements, tell me 10 supplements. Okay, I can do that, right? But that's not necessarily the best path forward.
Yeah, and I think that's important for folks to hear because it is so often in our nature to say, give me a pill for that. And in the wellness world, people might say, oh, well, I don't want to go on this medication, but they still have the same behavior of like, oh, I don't want to change, give me a pill for that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it is important to reinforce that, supplements they are a supplement. Like you can't excavate your entire metabolism by like
Mm-hmm.
taking a handful of pills. Like the lifestyle piece needs to be there.
100%. I mean, and one thing you could consider a magic, if anyone out here, might include myself, and it doesn't maybe doesn't prioritize sleep an extra 45 to 60 minutes, especially if you sleep under 6 hours or under 7 hours and it puts you above the 6 or 7 hour threshold. Sleeping an extra 45, 60 minutes is basically taking like a magic pill that's going to reduce insulin resistance, that's going to help the gut microbiome, right? And I think it's worth bringing up because I'm sure you resonate with this. Like it's kind of like in your head, if you can't get 7 hours, like, okay, I must just get 5. Like I'm already up anyway. Let me just keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to be tired regardless. Well, actually, like scientifically, perhaps that's not the best way to look at it because 45 to 60 minutes actually can make a difference between, changing insulin resistance negatively or not. So that's something else to consider.
For you as a dietitian, so like if people are listening to this and being like, whoa, okay, I need more of this, how can
Mhm.
people work with you? Where can people get your information online?
Yeah, so they can AndyTheRD is my .com is my website, it's my Instagram, it's my TikTok. So if you type in AndyTheRD and like a bunch of other words after, you'll probably find something, in a relevant topic that you want to know about. I probably have like some content on it somewhere. So that's the easiest way to find me. And I have an online course and community for fatty liver, and I also do private consultations and often combine those two together. So yeah, those would be the different ways to find me.
Yeah. How did I usually ask this question and I haven't yet. So
Mhm.
particularly because, we grow up and we're told like, firefighter, police officer, school teacher, doctor.
Mhm.
Not a lot of people know what a dietitian is when they are 7 years old. So like, how did you find dietetics? Like what was sort of your path to becoming a dietitian?
Yeah. So yeah, it's I guess a cliche story, but I guess a little bit interesting, a few interesting parts. I think when I was, growing up until the age of 16, 17, I paid no mind at all to nutrition. So that's the cliche part, right? Obviously, what I'm going to say next is when I started to pay attention to it, well, a few things happened. First of all, it took me forever to understand, to reach a place of tranquility around food that actually benefited my life. But ultimately it did, right? So first of all, I'm like, okay, well, this stuff changes your life, but also it's like if you don't know what you're doing, you're gonna expose yourself to unnecessary, pain and challenges. So I'm like, I want to play that role of condensing that journey for people, right? And the second part is, in my first year at the University of Toronto, in my head, I did well in sciences. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'll be a doctor. And so I did horrendously my first year at the University of Toronto, but my GPA was just enough to get into the nutrition major. It was 2.7. It's okay, which is I think good at U of T or decent. And 2.7 was the minimum requirement. So I'm like, all right, this is a sign. I'm going to nutrition. It's done. And I never looked back since. Yeah,
That's amazing.
that's no.
I also wanted to be a doctor, but I wanted to be like, because, I am the generation that I am. I was like, oh, I want to be like an integrative physician, because this was like in
Mm-hmm.
the 90s when this was new. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, so I'm going to go like learn about nutrition, because doctors don't learn about nutrition. And then I got into the nutrition program. I was like, what the heck is a dietitian? I was like, oh, wait,
Right.
spending an hour talking to someone about their like nutrition and lifestyle, which is like in my head what I thought I was going to do as a doctor. And yeah, it sealed it for me. I was like, no, this is it.
Yeah.
This is
Oh yeah.
absolutely
There's
it.
no question. This is what I'm like. I like what I need to be doing. Right. This is I can't imagine doing anything else besides this.
Yeah.
So I think it was more so my sister's a doctor, which is awesome. Very proud of her. But it's more so like the idea of it. You don't really know what it entails. But for me to do to have this conversation with you, to make this content, to like look into this stuff, that's for me like that's like the pinnacle of joy professionally. So I'm in the right place for sure.
I love it. Like mic drop. Anyone wondering if they want to become a dietitian, they'll just listen to this and they'll be super inspired. I mean, this episode has been so jam packed with like really, really useful information, which I appreciate so much. So I feel like now we can shift into the rapid fire questions, a few more getting to know yous. So,
Mhm.
first things first, do you have any secret skills or hidden talents?
I'm actually increasingly good at cooking. So that could be, and I don't ever really show that off, but people close to me know that I've gotten better at cooking over the years. Part of it is simply from using more herbs and spices, in all honesty.
I mean,
So,
what's one of your favorite things to cook right now?
I mean, I'm big with cooking fish. I cook chicken thighs a lot for guests. I mean, and that's on tofu. I'm gonna have to throw tofu in there. Broccolini, um, white and purple sweet potatoes with some cinnamon. Yeah.
Okay, then pizza or sushi, you can only choose one.
Yeah, for me it's sushi. Yeah, I don't love cheese, so it's sushi all day. It's easy.
I was like, who doesn't? I was one of those vegetarians who was like, I could go vegan except for the cheese. Like cheese was like my first and most important love. It took me a while to like figure it out. Okay.
Yeah.
Now a little bit of a personal question, if you're
Mhm.
willing to share. Are there any supplements that you take daily?
So wow, that's a good one. You know what? So I don't actually take any supplements right now, and I eat a large amount of fish. And so I'll just say this because this is not a secret. I talked about it on my social media. So now, this technically speaking, like this course of action actually could have been very stupid. But in my head, I was like, so fish is the only real, like, besides stuff that's added to products, is the only source of vitamin D and omega 3 like EPA and EHA. So I eat a lot of fish, okay, like a lot. And so I got my vitamin D levels checked, and actually I was like within range. So I was like, okay, cool. So like, this wasn't like the worst decision of my life not to be so stubborn not to take a vitamin D supplement. So yes, there you go. There's an extended answer to that. I should probably get my levels checked again. I don't advise this, of course, at all to anyone. I just decide to like do it, and yeah, but not advisable. Not advisable.
Well, yeah, and to like sort of like highlight that again, you mentioned that exactly fish is one of the only proper sources of vitamin D in
Mhm.
the food supply, because I think people are
Yeah.
still not getting the message on vitamin D, because it's so unique, because we weren't sort of designed to get it in our food supply except for fish, which I
Mhm.
mean, the irony is, and I'm just like off on a tangent now, when you think about how many of our like Arctic populations consume a ton of fish, a place where there isn't
Mhm.
a lot of daylight. I mean, there's so
Yeah. No, it's cool.
humanity and the planet is all really cool. So yes, vitamin D is super important. And yes, Vaish is like
Yeah.
one of the only major sources. Okay. Speaking of like, the Arctic and stuff, uh, if you could go anywhere, money, no option, where would your next dream vacation be?
Honestly, I like for me, I would probably, I mean, I'd probably go to London because I love soccer. But that's not really a hidden talent because I talk about it sometimes on my page. But I love soccer. London's expensive, so it just makes sense. And European, like for me, when I say I love soccer, to put that into context. I speak about nutrition at a certain level, like and I can have these like nerdy conversations. Like soccer is the same for me. I'm at that level, right? So in Europe, I fit well in Europe because people are at that level and there's that great passion. So yeah, I would say London. Although if I had more time, I'm sure I could think of a funnier, like the Serengeti and things like that. Obviously really cool, but I just say London. Yeah, I won't overthink it.
But no, but I also love that because it came to you first because
No,
it's connected to a true passion, which I
yeah,
love. We're also like a pretty, like not to that level of nerdiness, but we are a pretty big soccer house around here. That's the dominant sport in this house. So love it.
okay, love
Okay,
it, love that.
last one. And you have already given us so many practical tips, but I'm going to like
Hmm.
force one more out of you. If there was
Hmm.
only one thing that someone did after listening to this podcast that would make them healthier, like one sort of concrete habit that you want people to walk away with.
I would say to eat a quarter, half a cup of legumes per day. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with that one. If I said something else, it would just be for the sake of saying something else. So I'll stick with my guns.
No, I like it. It's principled. It's
No,
awesome.
no.
Andy, thank you so much. It's been so nice to be able to like catch up and learn from you. And I just know that there's so many helpful pieces of like tips and advice that people are going to walk away with.
Thank you so much for having me. You're an exceptional host, exceptional conversation, and yeah, no, it was amazing. It was really really rewarding and enjoyable to be a part of. So thank you for having me.